much for being here with us today. So I thought I could start by just saying how I know you. And we have just, in fact, this morning been on the third of 3 mindful music sessions together with Martha, who appears at other points in the festival. We were running a session for a London-based charity called Spitalfields Music, helping creatives to touch mindfulness in their lives as creative people, musicians. So I've got to know you just through Zoom and through Martha over the last month, really. And yes, I've had the pleasure of introducing you in each of our sessions. We've done it very Plum Village style. We've introduced each other. And in my research on you and your practice, I've learned that you always had a love for music. You were in a band, in a trio called the Maram Trio, and then you studied music, and then, I'm not sure if I'm getting this quite in the right order, but you developed a passion for mindfulness and for listening, for deep listening, and went on to turn that into a project whereby people would get together, musicians could have a space where they could get together and led by you and other facilitators as well, learn about what mindfulness and music means together. And then also there's a personal story which we'll touch on today, which is the reason that you wrote composed some of the songs and the music that we're going to hear today. How did I do there, Susanna?
Yeah, well done.
Great.
Yeah. As a musician, I just found over the course of the past 20-some years that mindfulness practice not only touched me as a person, but also in many ways as a musician. And in my teaching of piano teaching and workshop teaching, and in my writing of music and my listening to music and playing the piano. So mindfulness practice has kind of sneaked in into all these areas of my life without me even noticing at first. And then when I did notice how, for example, being more embodied makes a huge difference in my playing of the piano, and how feeling more present with my piano students allows for a different kind of flow in the lessons. When I did notice, I became really intrigued and curious, and was wondering whether mindfulness practice could be of help for other musicians. And so I've circled around this theme of mindfulness for musicians in many kinds of ways as an educator. So I put on my first Sounds and Silence retreat in 2012, and that was to try out some of these things on musicians or with musicians.
In the UK, is that?
Yes, that was actually here where I live at Findhorn.
Yeah.
And we had, I think, something like 14 people who came, both trained musicians. There was a Suzuki piano teacher, there was a Japanese concert pianist, and there were some people who self-confessed were not musical. And they phoned me beforehand, one lady, and asked whether she could come. So it was open to everyone who would like to make sounds and listen to sounds. And so it ended up being a very diverse group. And we explored mindfulness practice together and intuitive music making and deep listening, a lot of it outdoors.
And how much of that was based on the Plum Village teachings, would you say?
Yes, it was based on the Plum Village teachings.
Okay.
Yeah. And also on deep listening, as developed by Pauline Oliveros and her community. I had been on a deep listening retreat with her in 2005, and so that work has also influenced my work very much. And I later, much later, only 2 years ago, I trained as a deep listening facilitator as well. But then already in 2012, the deep listening was very much on my radar, and I shared that with people as well.
What's the process of training with deep listening? I wonder if you could describe what it's like to train as a deep listener.
Yeah, it's very much about listening at all times, where we might hear but screen out a lot of what we hear, and then to reverse that and receive all the sounds that are there, and then that becomes a meditation to receive all the sounds that are there without labeling them. And then Pauline Oliveros developed lots of deep listening practices and pieces where maybe you remember sounds from your childhood, or the body is important. So we listen, we do full body listening, and we listen for the resonances of sounds in the body, and we also work with the energy of the body. In a deep listening session, we would do a few loosening and qigong exercises to become more fully embodied, to have some mindfulness of the body. And then of course we sound also together, and we listen to our own sounding, and we listen to the sounds that others make. So there's many interesting deep listening pieces that were composed to bring our attention to sounds in all kinds of different ways.
It reminds me of a friend I had who was an opera singer, and they said that in their training they were told that your whole body is the instrument, and so everything's resonating.
Yes.
I found very beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you, we're going to hear some of your music today, and I wondered, could you say a little bit about that? There was 3 of you, wasn't there, in that band?
Yes, Marama Trio. People often struggle to pronounce it. Marama Trio. Marama is a word from the Maori language, and it means moon.
And how did that come together?
I had the good fortune to travel in New Zealand in '96, and it was my one big travel I had the chance to do. And when I was wandering around in Auckland, there was a street sign that was called Marama Avenue. And I just loved the sound of the word Marama. It's so beautiful. And I also have a song on a piece on the CD which is called Marama Avenue, which I took as a symbol for the traveling into the unknown. The moon, I guess, is somehow mysterious, and it waxes and wanes, and so Marama Avenue is I guess about embracing the unknown in our life's journey. And just the sound of Marama is my rudimentary Maori. I was and still am very keen to learn about Maori culture. There were many things I learned that touched me very deeply. And I at one point had a show composed from slides from my journey and from readings from Maori people's writings, and my own music, and these things weave together. It was called Aotearoa, the Land of the White Cloud, many years ago. Yeah, so I just am very interested in Maori culture, and I feel we have a lot to learn
Mm.
there about living in harmony with nature and with what we call the environment, but which is really part of us, really.
Mm. So they live, as I understand, quite yeah, an embodied sense of into being teachings. I think that's what my experience has been.
I had one beautiful autobiography of a woman, Maori elder, and
Mm.
she told the story how she went collecting shellfish with her grandchildren, and she kept throwing some back into the sea, and only some of it went into the bucket. And the grandchildren said, "Granny, why do you do this?" And she said, "Well, we need to share with the spirit of the sea. We only take what we need, and we give back the rest." And that was something that touched me very deeply at the time, and still does.
Yeah, yeah, that wisdom can be, yeah, sown, seeds sown in the children that marry adults of tomorrow. Mm. And so the album that we're going to be listening to a few songs from, um, that was, when was that composed?
Actually, the songs stem from probably over a decade.
Mm.
So the album came out in 2009, and it's old now by standards of
Mm.
music business, but I still love it a lot. I still love the music, and I guess some of them were written in the 90s,
Mm.
and some of them were written for the album in 2000, and yeah, from 2005, 6, 7.
You picked two tracks in particular to listen to. Could you tell us, maybe just pick one of those and just talk about that?
So one of my favorites, although they are all favorites, but one of my favorites is Magie de la Pluie, The Magic of Rain. And it's quite a long meditative track. And I had always wanted to record the rain
Mm.
and have that as a backdrop to a piece. I love the sound of the rain. I find there's something entrancing about it. And I did record the rain, and although I live in Scotland, the rain is actually German rain on this track, including the pigeon that you can hear. I recorded it in a friend's garden.
Mm.
So northern German rain, and the piece is very soothing, I find, and I I muffle the piano strings. So it's recorded on a grand piano, and I have one hand inside where I muffle the strings and play on the keys with the other hand. So it doesn't really sound like piano. It sounds like, I don't know, it sounds different. And yeah, I wanted something really simple for the piano because the piano can be such a virtuoso
Mm.
instrument, and I've never felt drawn to virtuosity. I actually like simplicity,
Mm.
and so this is a very simple piano part, but it's I think it's a 7/8, or it's an uneven time signature. it was not so easy for my collaborators on saxophone and Anya on saxophone and Jens on double bass to get into that groove. So it's simple with a twist, one could say. And then in the middle part where we improvise, the other players also use what is sometimes called extended instrumental techniques. So the double bass player Jens, he uses drumsticks on the different parts of the double bass, and Anya on saxophone, she makes sounds with the, don't know how you call that, the keys, I think it's also called on the saxophone, and with a breath. So we were playing with all kinds of sounds basically against the backdrop of the rain.
Yeah. And the other one was Lullaby, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The lullaby, in that incarnation that you get to see with the images from Scottish landscapes, that has a special story. Why I put it up at that time on YouTube. So maybe the reason why I made this album in the first place was it came out of a difficult time in my life in 2005. So 15 years ago, I lost a very dear friend of mine and ex-partner. He died from suicide, and that was, of course, a huge shock and trauma. And yeah, there is one song on the album which is called Beyond Gone that came out kind of soon after, and it's like a conversation with my friend. It was like, I remember the feeling, I have to talk with him. His name was Howard. I need to talk with Howard, and I need to do this through the piano. So I sat down by the piano, and although there was no intention of making a piece, but still somehow I felt inspired to record this. And it was an improvisation, of course. I mean, if you want to call it that, it was a conversation. And then I had this conversation. It was very meaningful. And then I forgot about the recording. And then I just found it again 2 months later. And listened back to it, and it felt, wow, this is very deep, but also it's lovely music. I mean, lovely doesn't really describe it. It's quite raw, very deep, and so I felt actually I'd like this to become a piece. So I sat down and wrote what I played. Wrote it down. I transcribed the improv so that I could play it again. And then it had the name. The name that came up was Beyond Gone, which is a phrase from Stephen Levine's beautiful book, Who Dies, which I read at the time.
And in context to the book, what does it refer to?
Not sure I remember now. It's so long ago.
Okay.
I think what stayed with me was the sense that we can connect with people on the other side, as it were.
Mm.
I had many dreams from Howard and still have about once a year, have my Howard dream. And yeah, there is the sense of lasting connection. And why I then was moved to make an album, and the album is called Continuations, is there are several bits to it. One bit is that Howard and I were sharing a computer.
Mm.
And so this was now my computer, and there was lots of beautiful photography of his on this computer. And and then I heard a talk by Thich Nhat Hanh at one point. I went to Plum Village for a winter retreat to soothe my pain and to be held in community in a good environment to grieve
Mm.
and and to make sense and to come through the shock. And Ty was asked a question about suicide, and what he said was, when someone takes their own life, they don't continue very beautifully.
Wow. How was that to hear?
And on the one hand, I felt he's right. There is a mess. There's
Mm.
Howard had children, two now grown-up children,
Yeah.
and and so there is that legacy of, in the moment it was devastation,
Mm.
and but I also felt I don't want it to stop there with devastation. I had already been to Plum Village many times, several times, and I was already had been practicing for 10 years. So I had an established mindfulness practice to fall back on and to hold me. And I had a Sangha,
Mm.
still have, which was invaluable, and also the Findhorn community. So I was surrounded by community and well-meaning people who, many of who have an understanding of
Mm.
transformation and of how loss and pain can be held and embraced,
Mm.
and through that eventually become the compost for a rose to grow, so transformed into something else. And so I was practicing and journaling on a daily basis with my grief. And I felt at the time, I wrote some poems actually. And when I read these poems now, I find it quite intriguing and touching how this grief actually brought me closer to life.
Wow. Okay. Mm.
So just to be in very good conditions to allow that grief, and knowing it won't overwhelm me
Mm.
because of the practice, because of community. So I was able to hold that grief and yeah, allow it the time that it took, and it took probably 4 years or so
Mm.
to be transformed. And that was a very, very, looking back, it was a very, very powerful experience to, yeah, to live with this grief. And of course, it was not all plain sailing. I remember there was anger at times, and I would go running in the dunes and discharge some of that energy. But I never felt cut off from life or depressed or numb,
Mm.
for which I am very grateful. It was as if that,
You didn't feel that during the whole time.
no, it
Or,
was like as if the grief and the ability and the conditions that were there allowing me to be with this grief, have this grief part of my life, yeah, propelled me deeper into life rather than the opposite.
did you have views about suicide before this happened, and have they changed?
Say again?
I wonder whether your relationship to suicide before this event, whether and how you experience it now, being someone who's been through that in such a deep way. I wonder if that's changed at all for you.
I'm not sure that's such a good question. That's something I would have to ponder for a very long time.
Okay, sure.
uh,
Yeah, that's fine, Sam. No problem.
it's more to continue that previous thread of continuation.
Yeah,
That hearing Tai say that this person doesn't continue very beautifully, I was like, but I want my friend to continue beautifully.
yeah,
And I almost felt, I guess, mindfully obsessed at times. And really, it was very strong in me, that desire for him to continue beautifully.
yes, sure.
And so I think it was a dream actually, where I saw one of his photos that he had taken from the Scottish West Coast. I saw it as an album cover.
Mm.
And I might not have made an album otherwise, but it felt like I need to make this album for him to continue beautifully.
Mm.
And so that's why now it's plural, because it turned out to be continuations in many ways. So his beautiful, Howard's beautiful photography is on the album cover. That's a continuation of his creativity. And when I held the finished album in my hands after 4 years of grieving and then working on it, I felt my grief has continued, is continuing now as a beautiful offering. And
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah, and I have a quote of, I think it's an indirect quote, not a direct quote, of Ty's on the inside of the album, where it says, nothing exists on its own. Everything continues in each other in manifold ways, and nothing is ever lost.
Mm.
That's something I heard Tai say. Nothing is ever lost, and I have felt great comfort in this. That, yeah, nothing was ever lost. This relationship with my friend was not lost. and I can still feel it after so many years.
Interested in that, you talked about that conversation you were having through the piano with Howard, and I wonder if how present the memory is now, what it was like to begin that conversation. I wonder, I'm interested in how that kind of came about, and if you remember how you were feeling when it started.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember this very vividly. It's yeah, as if it was yesterday. We have a beautiful venue at Findhorn, which is called the Universal Hall. It's a 300-seater with a beautiful old Steinway grand piano, and I rehearsed there a lot and had concerts, including an album launch with Marama Trio in 2009. And so I went to the hall and I got from the hall office the keys and locked myself in because Findhorn has lots of visitors, and it was not uncommon when I practiced in the hall that someone would wander in and just sit there for a little while, which is usually fine, and then go again. But I felt this was such a tender and vulnerable thing to do, so I locked myself in and put the grand piano into the middle of this. It's a pentagonal space with a beautiful acoustic, and opened the grand piano, and I deeply listened. I listened, and then my hands started to wander and do things and speak, as it were. And it felt really like a meditation. It was a meditation, and I could really feel the connection. And yeah, and I was able to say some things through sound that maybe don't even have words. And it was almost yeah, it was a very deep meditative state from where this came from. And when I listened to it later, I had no memories afterwards. I couldn't have told anyone what I had played. And when I listened back to it afterwards, it was interesting for me and lovely and touching to notice the different qualities. There was really something very raw, and yeah, the raw grief, but also there was tenderness and love and peace at times, also rage. So yeah, really a lot of a whole range of emotional responses.
I was telling you earlier that I was a volunteer with the Samaritans for 10 years, and actually took a sabbatical to go and spend some time in Plum Village. And one of the things that stayed with me from that time was kind of how difficult it can be for someone experiencing thoughts and feelings around suicide to express it to those closest to them because it might worry them, and also just how much of a taboo it really is in our society. And I don't know actually whether that's to do with suicide. I think that's maybe to do with death actually, and or ideas about death. And yes, I know for me that the idea of continuation, it spoke very much to an unmet conversation around people passing. And yeah, so I found it very, yeah, very touching to hear your, but in some ways it feels very, I mean, I don't know how accepting it was for you, the situation, but certainly to take what was, I'm sure, heavy emotions and turn them into something creative. Um, and as you say, a conversation beyond words. Yeah.
Yeah, there was one inspiration in particular that helped me a lot, and that was a book that came to me through a friend who said, "Read this." And it was a German book, so I looked up recently. It's not been translated into English. In German, it's called "Ich sehe deine Tränen," which means "I see your tears." And it was written by a German Greek psychologist who now does lots of workshops on grief and grief counseling. And now it's a little bit more common, but 15 years ago that was not common at all. As you say, it was very much a taboo. I was at times outside of my Sangha, I felt quite alone because it was almost too big to name suicide. And it was not something that could be talked about in even in my own family.
Mm.
Yeah, I did feel quite alone, but then I had community in various ways. And this book inspired me because he did a scientific study, or maybe he quoted scientific studies. Don't remember the details, but he found that there are pockets in Greece of ancient villages who have ancient rituals around grief, who come together when someone dies and who use their voices to express. There is the Celtic ritual of keening with the voice to express grief, and they seem to have something similar there. But it all happens in community, and even several years, every year on the anniversary, the community comes together to celebrate, to connect with this person on the other side, as it were. And he found that in these communities, small villages, people have significantly lower rates of heart diseases, of cancer, and so they are healthier.
Yes. Which
And that made such an impression on me that I felt so inspired to claim my grief and to find ways of expressing it. And I had wonderful friends who put up with me, who were there. And because no doubt that brings up feelings in other people as well, um, and who went through it with me. And And so that was very strong for me after reading this book, that I felt not only I want to claim these feelings, but I also want to, for us collectively as a community, as a society, that there is a place for grief and loss, and that we together we learn ways. And of course mindfulness is a wonderful way of holding and together in community, holding grief, and so that it can eventually transform.